Hi, everybody. This is Lex again, and here we are with another integration podcast. Today, we are going to have a look at sandbox environments, and we have an Azure MVP with us who is specialized in that area. And that's Luke Murray, all the way from Hamilton in New Zealand. Well, welcome to the channel, Luke.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you indeed. We already had a couple of little chats before we actually started with the session. Indeed, you have written a couple of blogs about sandbox environments. You started off with a bit more conceptual blog. When was it? About a month ago or something like that. Followed by a bit more practical article. Sandbox environments are just so important. As a kind of getting experience with specific technology somebody is not completely aware of. So I think
technology moves so fast, right? When you're working with cloud technologies, you're not only thinking about new technologies, new capabilities, but new features and existing technologies, and people need a place where they can learn this stuff without impacting production, and then that's where the concept of the sandbox stuff came into play. But it started very conceptual, and then it turned into more of a you're building blocks.
Exactly. Yeah. No, indeed, it's just so convenient to have an isolated environment where you can safely play with anything without any disruptions. So that's really great. Yeah. Okay. Well, I just want to hand over to you. I'll move the screens. What did you say? We use this one, and I would say just go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. So today we're just going to talk about sandboxes, as Lex has sort of alluded to. It's all about not being a pathway to production. This is not considered, when you're talking about a sandbox environment, you're not considering a dev test or pre-prod environment. You're considering more of an environment where people can play and test things at a time scale. So you might have an environment for a couple of months or a couple of weeks, depending on what you want it to do. It's limited in scope, but you can still play and choose things. I used to have a manager that said to me, click, oops, because I would always be quite fast clicking buttons, for better or worse, than when I was quite young and, quite eager to get involved. And so that has stayed with me throughout the years, about click, oops. And so, the sandbox environment is really a place where you can actually just go and click around and not really worry about the impact to production. So that's setting the context for that.
Indeed, there can be an oops, but it's not that serious, right? You're in an isolated environment, so
that's right. That's the intention of it anyway. So it's funny how things just like random sayings like that really stick with you over the years. But who am I? So my name is Luke Murray. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP from Hamilton, New Zealand. I work for an MSP called Datacom, and I run a Microsoft Learning Room community, so where students can sort of come and ask questions, and I share content and run sessions for students online. It's just a Microsoft Teams thing, community as well. So it's part of the Microsoft Worldwide Initiative, but that keeps me busy. So let's we'll start off with the conceptual idea around sandbox environments, sort of where I see it fitting into, and then we'll get more into sort of more of the technical implementation elements and things you can consider. So if we look at Gartner, which is an independent vendor organization out there that really had a look at what the industry trends were and the top 10 strategic technology trends of 2024 that they saw was really about, well, AI as a partner, right? No surprise there. Safe, continuous threat management, sustainability across, the globe and the way that we use technology. And really the concentration here, number 4, it's about platform engineering or developer-driven self-service capability. And so we want to give developers and Sandbox users really an environment where they can play and test these things with. So, 2024 is not only the year of AI or the year of actually using it and consuming those services, but it's also the rise of the builders as well. And it is that platform engineering where platform teams give the platform as a service in terms of, Azure or AWS or GCP, even, on premises to the developers and to the application owners to really consume the technologies that they want while being guarded with organizational sort of guardrails as well. Like, you can only be in these regions, data sovereignty, stuff like that. It's looked after by the platform team, and then you just worry about consuming it. And this works really well when we start to think about the concepts of the sandbox environment. So yeah, platform engineering is really the discipline of building and operating those self-service internal platforms maintained by a dedicated product team, but it's designed to support the needs of the users consuming it. This is another image from Gartner, and I think it really displays, when we're talking about kind of the platform team giving the ability to developers or sandbox users, it's really about, reusable components, tools, platform services, and the knowledge that people are using to build this stuff. When the problem that you might have with a dev test environment, for example, is that people may be adopting cloud technologies and wanting to modernize their applications in a production-like environment, but they don't have the knowledge or the context. They may not have the knowledge or the context in order to build that in a secure way. So the sandbox environment allows them to really play with that. So as a Microsoft Azure MVP, I wouldn't be amiss if it wasn't a talk that was focused primarily on the way that Microsoft Azure can help deliver this capability. And first, we'll talk with Azure landing zones. So I'll go through the conceptual, and then we'll delve into some of the more technical elements. So an Azure landing zone is really best practice guidance from the cloud adoption framework by Microsoft that they've had in their own experience of moving to the cloud, as well as issues experienced or best practices gathered from multiple organizations adopting cloud and Azure capabilities over the years. And so just like anything, right, depending on what you're going to build, whether it's a house or a stadium or, I'm quite a Stargate fan, so, a city ship, really depends on the foundations that you need to build those. And building a cloud platform is exactly the same, as I'm sure Lex can contest to, right? Every organization is different, and every cloud platform is different in the way that those get consumed.
True.
So some of the landing zone design areas to consider as part of the cloud adoption framework, really about identity, resource organization, business continuity, disaster recovery, your governance disciplines, which is quite key when you're talking about a sandbox environment, and network connectivity as well. So all these base design areas feed into what your enterprise scale or what your landing zone architecture may look like for production and for your dev test workloads. But it's also the same when you're same considerations when you're thinking about a sandbox environment. For example, is it isolated from production in a completely different inter-ID tenancy? Is it off to the side and more of a canary-based level? It really depends on organizational requirements, restrictions, and the type of ownership across that environment as well. I just realized that this still has Azure Active Directory. I must update this slide or this image.
Don't say it too out loud. Nobody will notice.
yeah. OCD over these things. Yeah, but yeah. So let's get back to kind of the platform engineering concepts and how it can work with the sandbox environment. So yeah, the sandbox is really not your dev test environment. It's your click oops environment, and it's really about accelerating your projects. It can be sandbox type environment, can be used for things like self-learning. So if you're studying for a certificate or exam, hackathons. So you're giving a team or multiple teams of people access to an Azure environment in order to learn and drive creativity, whether it's an organization, testing, and development.
True.
So sandbox environment usually contains, data isolation. So it's isolated really from the rest of your production, virtual WAN or hub and spoke, things like that. Network security, identity and access controls, and compliance and regulatory considerations as well. What regions can you host your data with? The intent of the sandbox environment, in my mind, is not really to host your production data. It's really about synthetic data or data that you can test or play with in order to help drive those out. So you have to be very, very careful about, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah. And this is also just so useful, right? Well, in such a sandbox environment, security initially isn't really an issue. And well, when you're playing with specific technologies, security can always be hard and can also be a blocker, right? And when you have such an isolated environment like a sandbox, well, you can simply open up everything within that environment and still experience everything without being hindered with that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and it's hard to get organizations' heads wrapped around. And it is definitely one of those things. And it's really about actually, that's really good timing because it's really about the trade-offs in terms of the sandbox environment versus your production environment, right? And that comes down to when you're talking about things like Microsoft Azure, you're talking about things like management group structures that contain subscriptions. You're talking about Azure policy, and that's really what helps drive some of your security governance and Defender for cloud configuration. But yeah, you're right. A lot of these things that you would be implementing in dev test and implementing in production are almost anti-intuitive. Like they don't work well with the sandbox environment where someone could be just clicking through and creating, an Azure web app or an Azure function, or the latest great Azure OpenAI service that might still be in preview and might only be in Pacific regions. So these are the trade-offs to really consider when you're looking at building out your sandbox environment. Is really, I wouldn't recommend people restrict locations for that very reason. Like if you consider Azure OpenAI, right, the GPUs in order to enable that capability in those models aren't in all regions. And they're in different regions at various stages of their life cycle as well. So for example, you might have a new model, a new GPT-4 model come out, and that may only be available in West US. But for me, like Australia or East is the closest Azure region at the moment. New Zealand North is coming, but Australia East may not get that same model until a couple of months down the track, as the capacity and the need for those models starts to develop. So I really question organizations when they think, oh, for a sandbox environment, you really need to restrict those locations, because it goes against the grain, I guess, of the sandbox thinking. And it's the same like for data sovereignty, right? And a lot of this is, we may have New Zealand or Australian government data. We know we can only store those in Australia, as an example.
Yeah.
But when we're dealing with a sandbox environment, we're not talking about production data. In fact, we shouldn't have production data in those environments. But overextensive block lists as well, so blocking certain resources. There are resources that I recommend to block. Things like application gateway. Things like virtual network, like gateway. Things like cross subscription peering. Those capabilities that can be leveraged to link a sandbox environment into your production network. They're the things I'd recommend to block. But we can talk more about that at the technical element, and really trying to build, the entire platform at once, right? You may be spending a lot of time developing more granular controls or more granular policies that may not really be in place or may not be needed. So, overextensive block lists as well. You could spend hours going through every single Microsoft Azure product, going no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, but really do it in an exception base.
Yeah.
So when we talk about sandbox environments, there's 4 different types to consider. So there's personal, and when I talk about personal, I talk about Visual Studio Enterprise subscriptions, or you've just got access to a credit card on your personal account. That's really the personal sandbox, and completely isolated from your organization in your own intra-ID tenancy, and not really where we're going to talk to today. And then the other sandbox types are unmanaged, lightly managed, and managed. And you might be scratching your head about that, but we'll get more into that shortly.
Yeah. No, that is indeed interesting, right? I mean, what model fits in what scenario? Probably it also depends on the kind of company we're talking about.
Yeah, it does depend a lot. Like it really does depend on things like financial control.
Exactly.
Does someone have the DFA or the financial delegation to approve those services? And if they do have them, is it for a team, or is it only for their resources? What is their budget? What about the size of your organization as well? It's like, so is it, if you're only wanting a sandbox environment for one person, then you could go into a resource group level.
True.
So there are a bunch of considerations to really consider, but this framework really should just help you align up the ways that you're thinking. And you can use all of these, or you could just use one of these and then build it out as you go. Again, this goes back to the trying to build it all at once, right? So when we're talking about unmanaged sandboxes, it's really about an individual or a team having access to an Azure subscription. And then within the context of that subscription, being able to do what they want. So add and remove resources, for example.
Yeah.
When we talk about lightly managed sandboxes, it's really about predefined resource groups. So instead of giving a team or an individual access to an entire subscription, they only have access to a resource group, and then within the subscription that contains those resource group, maybe other resource groups that can be shared by other sandbox owners or users. And then highly managed sandbox is really around where I don't want access. I'm a developer or an Azure user, consumer, and I don't really want access to the Azure environment to be able to send up resources. I know that I deploy an Azure web app, and it's the same Azure web app every single time. So I want a self-service portal where I can go in and I can spin that web app up, and then I can shut it down when not needed. So the various levels of the environments that we're talking about really depend on your use case and the amount of administrative effort and involvement of the platform team versus the flexibility that as a sandbox user you can get.
Yeah.
So with the unmanaged, remember this is the subscription-based scoping mechanism. It's less managed for you. It's more like, here you go, here's an Azure subscription, go for your life.
Yeah,
the ability for developers to customize and use it is definitely more flexible.
Yeah.
Lightly managed, definitely more, which is the resource group type scoping, is more sort of, okay, well, the platform team needs to create each management group, make sure the appropriate tagging, make sure that the role-based access control is okay. And as a consumer, you're limited into just that one resource group. When if you want to develop things at scale or test things at scale in more of a production type environment, you may be more limited by that. But again, that might be what you need. And then the managed one is, again, that I just want to deploy a web app, and it's the same web app all the time. The deployment of that is really managed by you, and you just consume it.
Yeah.
So yeah, the main difference is really about the managed sandbox is predetermined services, and lightly is more useful when you have lots of individuals just wanting access to a sandbox resource group.
Yeah.
And then the unmanaged environment, which is less restrictive because it's, here you go, here's a subscription.
Yeah.
And choosing between them really comes down to the purpose of what you want to use it for. Is it temporary, the security of it, the element or the boundary of what you can give access to and what kind of data that you want to store it into it, the life cycle of the sandbox environment as well. These are not supposed to be permanent environments. And monitoring integration cost. Really, a lot of the well-architected pillars, come into play around cost optimization, performance, operational efficiency, and security as well. But yeah, so I do have, this is the completion of more of the concepts around the sandboxes and what we're really talking about. Now I'll share my screen about elements that we can do to talk about implementing it. Any questions while I do that, or any thoughts?
No, I think this is great, right?
Yeah, a lot of people don't know where to start, and it's quite a daunting experience. And it is a different mindset from developing for production or a highly secure environment running mission critical workloads. So there's definitely some trade-offs there.
Yeah. No, that's even what I've been thinking, right? You can even think of having some ARM templates or scripts ready to provision a specific kind of sandbox environment. Where all kinds of protections and maybe cost awareness is already built in, so you can just easily provision it and get started with it.
Yeah, that's right, and it goes back to the sort of the platform engineering aspect of, we're not saying that the infrastructure teams or the platform owners, in terms of the cloud teams, we're going completely nuts, and everyone can have their own Azure environment or their own subscription. It's not really what we're saying. We're saying more the platform team can help deliver this capability to your users, who can then consume that service
Yeah.
as and when they need it. So hopefully you can see my screen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
This is directly. I don't have the slides for this, but this is directly from my article. But again, we'll start off with, this is more around the technical delivery elements to consider around kind of what you were talking, Lex, in terms of how would you go about building this sandbox type environment, and
Yeah.
what kind of tools would you use to deliver that? So for the rest of the talk, we're just going to really assume it's unmanaged sandboxes that we're talking about. So we've got large teams that need access to an Azure subscription where they can go nuts and have a play. There may be one person, or there could be multiple teams working on it. So that's really what this is highlighting here.
Yeah.
Now, again, when we're talking about unmanaged, we're talking about the sandbox users can really consume the service. It's still maintained by the platform engineering team. So it's really the platform engineering team or the infrastructure cloud teams that are really delivering this capability, and then developers or sandbox users are using it. So we're going to have a look really and consider implementation of a sandbox environment by the 5 cloud governance pillars of cost management, security baseline, identity, resource consistency, which is quite huge for this type of environment, where you want a sandbox environment that's consistent, it's a sandbox environment, and then deployment acceleration as well. How do people gain access to this type of environment? So I'll just cost management is huge when you're looking at a sandbox environment. People could go nuts with deploying, NVIDIA-based GPU machines with click of the button, high performance compute, and you still, even though it's a more relaxed atmosphere, you still need to make sure that you have clear guidelines on budget constraints.
Yeah.
Who's going to pay for that type of environment? And really the FinOps principles of shifting left, making sure everything is tagged, and empowering the people actually creating the technology, creating the resources, to really have that real-time access to the billing capabilities, the billing reports that they need.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, how do the people that are creating these resources know whether or not they're cost effective or not, if they're not empowered to get that data? So key value pairs, tags, really quite key to have. It's out of the box Azure. You can use things like Azure Policy to deliver it, or it could be built into your Azure your policy as code as well. Things like the cost center. So is your sandbox environment, all these resources get billed to a specific team or user? Is it just the cost model? So is it showback or is it chargeback? Do we just want to see how much this is costing, or do we actually want to charge this back to a customer or an internal resource? Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure that you can see. Resource owner, so having a resource or a sandbox environment tagged with an accountable owner for that environment is really key. And the resource owner can also be used to receive things like Defender for Cloud alerts and other things that we'll talk about shortly as well.
Yeah.
So there's a couple of capabilities really with FinOps that you can enable to your end users, and it's really around using workbooks that are from a Microsoft open source initiative called the FinOps Toolkit. So you can use the Azure Cost Management analysis capabilities already built into the portal, and I encourage you to do so, and make sure that the people using your sandbox environment also has access. But there's a bunch of Power BI reports or cost optimization workbooks that you can get, and governance workbooks you can get as well, which it's pretty small, but that can really help you. Like things like the governance workbook here is really key, especially for a sandbox environment, because you might be wanting to know what things are missing tags. When was the resource age? So when was that resource actually created? And when was it last modified? So you can grab a lot of the stuff from the resource graph directly with Microsoft, or you can, use this. So I highly encourage looking at things like the FinOps workbooks.
Exactly. Yeah, I've seen that cost optimization workbook indeed. That was still in preview. Is that GA now already, or not yet? Not sure.
No, I think it's still in preview, mainly because, you can use it. Just because the workbook's in preview doesn't mean that you can't use it, right?
No. Yeah.
But I think it's still in preview mainly because potentially the coverage of the amount of resource types may not really be, at an acceptable level. Because it's only reporting what it can out of the resource. But giving these workbooks to your sandbox users, even just as reader access, along with the Azure cost management tools, really key. It helps give them more data that they can work from.
Yeah, that's kind of the risk with the sandbox environment, right? Indeed, people can really go mental with provisioning expensive stuff and don't turn it off at the end of the day. And then, the cost will be immense, of course. And that's, that's why that cost awareness is just so important, maybe even more than in a production environment.
Yeah, and I think it leans towards the time-limited scale of a sandbox environment as well, because if you didn't have a limit on, like, okay, we're going to give you a sandbox environment, but unless you have really special circumstances on why you want to extend it, you can only have it for 3 months.
Yeah.
So time limiting helps prevent that sprawl as well. So budgets, very key as well. Not really intended to stop anything from happening. They're more advisory. So your organization might have a budget of $1,000 a month per sandbox environment. So when the sandbox environment gets created, a budget should be created straight off the bat with that standard set. And then the sandbox owner, based on infrastructure as code or anything is set, and then they get immediately, the sandbox owner gets an email alert if they're reading the 50 or the 70% mark of that budget requirement. Again, if they don't know, they can't do anything about it.
No, yeah.
even though there's a lot of trade-offs when you're considering a sandbox environment in terms of the production controls, the security baseline, like security, is still quite major in terms of sandbox thinking. So the reason I say that is your people using your sandbox environment, they're learning these technologies. You don't want to give a false sort of sense of, well, I just created an Azure storage account and the Azure portal, and it took me 5 minutes, and I now have, I don't know, 100 terabyte file share and all the stuff stored in it, right? And then
Cool.
they go and do the same thing in a dev test environment, and then suddenly they're under change control, or the public access that was allowed in the sandbox environment is not allowed in your dev test. So security in the likes of Microsoft Defender for Cloud, not to be ignored. Not really as enforcement, but more as inform. Like, you really want to teach your sandbox users when they're testing this technology about the best practices with this, how to secure their resource, right? So if I stand up Azure storage account or a key vault and I had it as public access and I'm learning about it, I don't know that that's got a public endpoint. Like, I'm learning about these technologies, right?
Yeah.
But then if Defender for Cloud sends me an email going, hey, you really should look at putting in IP whitelisting, or stopping anonymous access to blobs and things like that, then I can go, oh, I should do something about that. And then
Yeah.
actually, yeah. And so you can take those learnings, and then that allows you to more transition easier into like a dev test or a production environment.
Yeah, correct. To make it more enterprise ready. Yeah.
So again, it's more, to me, it's Defender for Cloud is really a lot more of an inform. Azure policy, very, very key. Again, making sure that your sandbox environment is operating in a consistent manner by the platform team. Really, that sets this. So there's a couple of, when you're considering looking at implementing a sandbox environment, there's a couple of Azure landing zone based policies based on the enterprise scale reference architecture that you can take a look at. One of these policies is ALZ sandbox guardrails. So these policies I recommend to deploy across your sandbox environment. And they've got the things like I talked about earlier, where you want to deny your VNet peering across subscriptions. Otherwise, you could allow someone access to link their sandbox environment with production or their own Azure environment as well. But you still want to be able to allow them to test within the same subscription.
Yeah.
If they're wanting to test like a hub and spoke model. So deny the deployment of virtual WANs or express routes and VPN gateways for the very same reason, and then enforce that. So a lot of enterprise scale policies, especially around the sandbox, very key, and you can just grab those policies and chuck them in.
Yeah.
Another policy that I'd recommend is decommissioned. So as part of creating a sandbox environment, so in this example, we're talking about unmanaged sandboxes, so a subscription, so an Azure subscription. we want a place where those subscriptions can go to get decommed, and you may want a place where those subscriptions can go when they're originally created before they're in use. So you could use the decommissioned management group off to the side, and then those Azure subscriptions can go into that. So, for example, you've got your decommissioned subscriptions going into the decommissioned management group, and then you've got Azure policies that are deploying the use of new resources and deploy like an auto shutdown policy in them as well. So that really makes sure that your subscriptions that are in those management groups aren't getting used. And that's a screenshot of my one. What I recommend when you're looking at policy within Azure is as code is EPAC. If my Google or Foo will work today, enterprise policy is code. So this is a really great open source initiative created by Microsoft employees, but not supported by Microsoft, which allows you to put your Azure policies as code. So things like your policy definitions, your assignments.
Yeah.
So where they are they at a resource group? Are they getting assigned to a resource group or subscription or management group? And even your exemptions as well. So if I go and set an exemption in the Azure portal for my Luke's favorite secret management group, because I'm an admin, so I get to do whatever I want, right? Then using enterprise policy as code, I could go, I don't know what you're smoking, Luke, but I know that I've got an Azure DevOps pipeline that runs enterprise policies code that will remove your unimproved exemption at midnight. Things like that go, yeah, maybe I'm not as smart as I think I am. So definitely Azure policy is code when you're considering it, and very, very useful if you're running multiple tenants as well. So you can do the same. You could have the same policies across multiple Entra-ID tenants that might be running Azure. So definitely worth investing in. Just wary of time, but terms of use. So another thing to consider really, and this touches back on the type of data that you might be, or your use cases of your sandbox environment. So Microsoft Azure built into the Entra-ID portal and the login experience has terms of use. So what you can do is I can go, I want my sandbox users, they're added to this group as part of the sandbox provisioning, and this group then gets the sandbox terms of use. So the first time that they log on to the Azure portal, they get a terms of use that do not store production data in this environment. You know that there's no support for this. There's no 24/7 support for this. It's really a good use case to really remind the users the type of environment that they're wanting to consume.
Correct.
And then they have to accept it.
Yeah, it is a playground, but still there are limitations. Yeah.
And you can enforce that for them to have to accept it every 30 days, or if there's a new change as well. But it's a hidden gem, but it's quite handy to have.
True. Yeah.
So now we get into more of the automation. So really about the resource consistency. So when we're talking about a sandbox or sandbox vending, to play on words, because it's usually subscription vending is the terminology that we use So sandbox vending is really about, I want to stand up these environments programmatically very, very quickly.
Yeah.
And so you could use something like an Azure DevOps pipeline or a GitHub Actions pipeline, running things like Terraform. And this is an example that I'm using really here, to stand up your Azure subscriptions, to stand up your role assignments. So Sandbox users get access to contributor on their own subscriptions, but no other environment, for example.
No, yeah.
Any service principals that you need, your budgets that I talked about earlier, programmatically stood up. Your workbooks could automatically be loaded into your tags, your Defender for Cloud configuration, alerting, and then you can even be nice to your Sandbox users and then give them a resource group or a virtual network to get going.
Yeah.
So really, the key here is using infrastructure as code in order to do that.
Clearly, yeah.
Oh, we touched on enterprise policy as code.
Right.
So one of the ways that I've done sandbox environments in the past is really about using Azure DevOps and Terraform. So a lot of organizations will have their own organizational based, like Azure pipelines. So build, deploy, test. These things need to be approved. Things like that. So they may already have a lot of templates in place in order to leverage GitHub Actions or, infrastructure as code deployments. I've used a product, again, another open source initiative based on a bunch of Microsoft engineers called Symphony. So Symphony is an intended sort of template service for continuous integration and continuous deployment of infrastructure as code on multiple orchestrators. What that really means is that it has example templates for things like Bicep deployment, Terraform deployment. It has example templates of Azure DevOps pipelines and GitHub Actions as well. So I recommend, really checking out Symphony.
Yeah, that's all great stuff, Luke. Indeed. Yeah. I think you have to go to the end of the webinar. Sorry, of the podcast. If it would be on me, we would be continuing for at least another hour, something like that. But
we're almost finished. But in terms of this, this is a snippet of Terraform. I just want to leave people with this. So this is a snippet of a Terraform to stand up your Azure environment using the landing zone vending Terraform module. And really the key here, and when you're considering about creating these sandbox environments, is trying to keep your code as clear as possible. So you're not making, you're not having to make changes to the code every single time you want to stand up an environment. So I'll just scroll down, but consider putting your variables or your parameters or all the context of your sandbox environment outside of the code. So in this example, I've got like a YAML file that really has things like the name of the sandbox, the owner of the sandbox, the budget amount, the expiry date, the cost center. These are individual to the sandbox environment that you're creating, but the rest of the code, like creating the resource groups and the virtual network and the subscriptions, is all consistent. These things are different. So it really means that you can just stand up a new environment by creating a new YAML file, Terraform will go and read the YAML file, do the deployment, and then when it comes to decommissioning, you can just delete that YAML file, and then Terraform will go and delete it. So just think about that. But
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, that kind of governance is just also so important, right? Again, well, it is a temporary environment, so indeed, after some time, everything should be decommissioned. So that's just equally
important. But it still does need like a level of, even though the word's unmanaged, sandbox can be quite a misnomer. I think that might be the right word. Not misdemeanor, because that would be a completely different subject. But yeah, it still requires a level of governance and really organization-based thinking of terms of what type of capabilities do my users need, but also making sure that they're able to do what they need to do. But it's great fun. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you were away for a couple of seconds, but the last words I picked up, the thank you part. Well, actually, we must thank you, of course. This has been a very interesting topic and very relevant for just everybody who is working on Azure anyway, right? Again, thank you so much. And for our audience, well, indeed, we hope that this has been of use for you, and we hope to see you in the next one.